For generations, the story of marble sculpture has been presented as one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. Historians describe it as a triumph of patience, discipline, and extraordinary manual skill. According to the traditional narrative, sculptors begin with nothing more than a block of stone and a set of simple tools: iron chisels, wooden mallets, abrasive powders for polishing. With these tools, artists slowly remove material, shaping the marble piece by piece until a figure emerges from the stone. The explanation appears reasonable. Marble is hard, brittle, and resistant. It fractures unpredictably. Every strike of a chisel carries risk. Remove too much material and the entire sculpture is ruined. This is why historical accounts emphasize the patience of the sculptor. Months of work, sometimes years. Michelangelo reportedly spent 4 years completing the statue of David. Bernini's major works often took several years to finish. Art historians tell us that these masterpieces represent the peak of human craftsmanship, achieved through relentless dedication. And when you stand before these sculptures, that explanation initially feels convincing. The surfaces are polished. The anatomy is precise. The figures appear lifelike, almost breathing despite being carved from stone. Museums present them as proof that extraordinary skill can overcome even the most difficult materials. But then something strange begins to appear when you look closer, not at the statue as a whole, but at the smallest details. Because in many of these works, marble behaves in ways that stone should not behave. Veins seem to rise beneath the surface of the skin. Fabric appears thin enough to see through. Fingers press into flesh that looks soft and responsive. The material does not appear rigid. It appears flexible, almost organic. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If marble is carved by removing stone, how can it look as though it was once soft? Why do these sculptures give the impression that the material could bend, stretch, and compress? The official explanation says this is simply artistic genius, an illusion created by careful carving and polishing. But the closer you examine the details, the harder that explanation becomes to accept without hesitation. Because some of these details do not look like illusions. They look like something else entirely. Look closely at the hands of certain marble statues, not from across a gallery, not through a photograph. Stand near enough to see the smallest details. On some sculptures, the veins on the backs of the hands are not simply carved lines. They appear swollen beneath the surface of the stone, following the natural pathways of human anatomy. The skin seems stretched over them, just as it would be on a living body. The marble does not look cut. It looks layered, almost as if something lies beneath it. How could that effect be created with a chisel? To carve a vein that appears to rise under the surface, a sculptor would have to remove stone around it, while preserving a delicate ridge only millimeters thick. One mistake would flatten the structure entirely. One misplaced strike, and the illusion would collapse. Yet across dozens of sculptures, the effect appears flawless. No hesitation marks, no visible corrections, no signs of trial and error. The same phenomenon appears in drapery. Marble cloth should behave like stone, thick, heavy, rigid, but in certain sculptures the fabric looks impossibly thin. It clings to the body beneath it, revealing the shape of ribs, muscles, and bones through what appears to be a translucent layer of stone. Some folds seem stretched tight across the figure, while others gather naturally under their own weight. The marble responds to gravity exactly the way real fabric would. Where the cloth bunches together, it appears dense and opaque. Where it stretches across the body, the underlying form becomes visible. How is that calculated? How does a sculptor determine the exact thickness required for the eye to perceive transparency in a material that cannot actually become transparent? And more importantly, how is it executed? Because to carve fabric that reveals the body beneath it, the sculptor must understand two surfaces simultaneously, the surface of the cloth and the surface of the body underneath. Every millimeter of stone removed from the outer layer must correspond perfectly with the shape beneath it. One mistake and the illusion fails. But in many famous statues, the illusion never fails. Even more puzzling are the areas where marble appears compressed. In several sculptures, fingers press into flesh that seems to respond to pressure. The skin dimples slightly beneath the touch. The surface curves inward, exactly the way living tissue behaves when force is applied. But stone cannot compress, so how do you carve compression? To represent a finger pressing into flesh, a sculptor would have to calculate the deformation of soft tissue under pressure, then translate that geometry into an unforgiving material that cannot be adjusted once carved. How do you predict that shape in advance? How do you carve it without destroying the surrounding structure? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, why do we see no intermediate examples? No experiments, No failed attempts, no unfinished sculptures showing how these techniques were developed. The effects simply appear. Perfect, fully realized, as if the knowledge required to create them already existed before the sculptor ever touched the stone. Once you begin cataloging these anomalies, certain sculptures appear repeatedly in discussions among researchers and engineers. They come from different periods, created by different artists, yet they display the same puzzling characteristics. One of the most striking examples stands in Rome inside the Borghese Gallery. Bernini's sculpture, The Rape of Proserpina, completed in 1622. At first glance, it appears simply dramatic, a mythological scene frozen in motion. Pluto seizes Proserpina as she struggles to escape. But when you look closely at Pluto's hand gripping her thigh, the marble begins to behave in a way that stone should not. The fingers appear to press into her flesh. The surface curves inward beneath the pressure of his grip, creating small depressions where the fingertips touch the skin. Around those indentations, the surrounding marble bulges slightly outward, just as real muscle would react when squeezed. This raises an immediate technical problem. Stone does not compress. So how does a sculptor carve compression? To achieve that effect, the artist would need to predict the exact geometry of soft tissue being displaced under pressure, then reproduce that deformation in marble, a material that cannot be adjusted once removed. One wrong strike and the illusion collapses, yet the illusion holds perfectly. Another famous example appears in Bernini's Apollo and Daphne. Here, the anomaly is different but equally difficult to explain. The sculpture captures the moment Daphne transforms into a laurel tree while fleeing Apollo. Her fingers stretch upward and slowly become leaves. Her hair spreads into branches. Bark begins forming along the surface of her skin. The transformation is gradual and seamless. Smooth human flesh transitions into rough tree bark without abrupt boundaries. Fingers dissolve into thin leaves so delicate they seem fragile enough to break. Every stage of the transformation appears anatomically consistent. How do you carve that transition? How do you sculpt two different materials emerging from the same form while preserving the illusion of motion? But perhaps the most puzzling example is the Veiled Christ in Naples. Created by Giuseppe San Martino in 1753, the sculpture depicts the body of Christ covered by a thin shroud. Yet the veil is carved from the same single block of marble as the body beneath it. And still, the face is visible through the fabric. The nose presses against the veil. The eyelids appear beneath it. The cloth clings to the body exactly as real fabric would behave under gravity. Where the material stretches thin across the chest, the form beneath becomes visible. Where the folds gather, the veil appears thicker and opaque. This illusion requires an extraordinary calculation. The sculptor must shape both the surface of the veil and the surface of the body beneath it at the same time. Every millimeter of marble removed changes the depth and transparency of the illusion. Too thin and the stone breaks. Too thick and the illusion disappears. Yet across the entire sculpture, the veil behaves exactly like real cloth. Individually, these sculptures can be explained as masterpieces of artistic genius. But when examined together, they begin to suggest something else. Not isolated miracles, but a recurring technique whose full method may no longer be understood. Up to this point, it might be tempting to dismiss these sculptures as isolated achievements. Extraordinary artists occasionally appear in history. Genius exists. Bernini, Michelangelo, and a handful of others might simply represent the peak of artistic ability. But that explanation becomes harder to maintain when the investigation expands beyond Italy, because the same kind of precision appears in stonework across the world. Different cultures, different centuries, yet the same pattern emerges. Consider the marble screens of the Taj Mahal in India. Known as jali, these carved panels transform solid marble into intricate geometric lace. Thousands of tiny openings are cut through thick stone, forming patterns so delicate that some perforations measure less than a millimeter across. One mistake would shatter the entire panel. A single crack could propagate through the lattice and destroy weeks of work. Yet these screens extend across large architectural surfaces, each section displaying perfectly repeated geometry carved from single slabs of marble. How were these openings measured? How were they cut with such precision using hand tools alone? And perhaps more puzzling, how were they repeated consistently across multiple panels without visible variation? Travel further west to Egypt, and a different kind of anomaly appears. In the temples of Luxor and Karnak, hieroglyphs are carved into stone surfaces that are far harder than marble. Many of these inscriptions are cut directly into granite, a material significantly more difficult to shape than the limestone used in most ancient monuments. Yet the carvings remain astonishingly consistent. Lines maintain uniform depth across long sections of wall. Edges remain sharp, even after thousands of years of erosion. The spacing between symbols appears mathematically controlled across surfaces spanning dozens of meters. Granite is one of the hardest stones commonly used in construction. So what tools produce these cuts? Copper chisels, the tools traditionally credited to ancient Egyptian craftsmen, should struggle to carve granite at all. Yet the evidence of precise carving remains. Move east again, to the Longmen grottos in China. Here, thousands of Buddhist figures emerge from sheer cliff faces. Each statue maintains careful and anatomical proportions. Facial features remain symmetrical. The figures appear almost standardized, as if produced according to a shared geometric template. But these sculptures were supposedly carved directly into rock walls, using hand tools over many generations. How was consistency maintained? How were proportions repeated across thousands of figures created over decades? And then there is one of the most extraordinary stone structures ever produced. The Kailasa Temple in Ellora, India. Unlike most temples, it was not built upward from blocks of stone. Instead, it was carved downward from a single mountain. Workers removed an estimated 400,000 tons of rock to reveal the structure beneath. Columns, halls, stairways, and sculptures all emerge from the same continuous mass of stone. The engineering challenge alone is difficult to comprehend, because carving downward leaves no margin for structural mistakes. Remove too much stone from the wrong area, and entire sections could collapse. Yet the temple remains stable, symmetrical, and intricately detailed. Across continents and centuries, the pattern repeats. Stone behaving in ways that seem to exceed the limits of the tools supposedly used to shape it. Precision that appears unexpectedly consistent. Techniques that appear fully developed without obvious stages of experimentation. Different cultures, different materials, different historical periods. Yet the same unsettling question keeps returning. Were these achievements simply the result of extraordinary patience and craftsmanship? Or do they hint at techniques that once existed but were later forgotten? When modern engineers and material scientists began examining some of these sculptures more closely, the mystery did not disappear. In many cases, it deepened. Because while art historians tend to focus on style and symbolism, engineers look at something different. They study the physical evidence left behind by the process itself: tool marks, surface texture, the internal structure of the stone. And in several cases, those details raise questions that remain unresolved. For example, microscopic analysis of certain marble surfaces shows polishing levels that are difficult to explain using hand tools alone. The stone appears smooth to a degree that normally requires sustained friction, pressure, and controlled abrasion over long periods of time. In theory, this could still be achieved manually, but the consistency of the finish across complex surfaces makes the process difficult to reconstruct experimentally. Then there are the tool marks. Traditional sculpting tools leave recognizable patterns. Chisels create linear impact marks. Rasps leave rough striations. Abrasive polishing creates distinctive curved scratches. Yet in some sections of famous sculptures, these patterns do not always appear where they should. Certain surfaces look almost melted. Others appear uniformly smooth, even in areas that would be extremely difficult to reach with traditional tools. Narrow folds of fabric, deep cavities between fingers, undercut spaces where a chisel would have limited access. Researchers have also identified subtle variations in the crystalline structure of marble within some sculptures. Normally, marble maintains a consistent internal pattern because it forms under stable geological conditions. But in certain areas of carved statues, the crystal alignment appears slightly altered compared to the surrounding stone. Some scientists have suggested that these changes might result from localized heat, pressure, or chemical interaction during the carving process. But the exact cause remains uncertain. Over the years, a few investigators have proposed more unusual possibilities. Explorers working in South America during the early 20th century documented indigenous stories about plant extracts capable of softening stone. According to these accounts, certain natural compounds could temporarily change the consistency of rock, making it easier to shape before it hardened again. Similar stories appear in scattered historical accounts from other regions. In the Andes, local traditions mention substances that could melt stone blocks used in ancient architecture. Some researchers have speculated that such compounds might interact chemically with the mineral structure of limestone or marble. To date, no verified substance has been proven capable of doing this reliably. But the persistence of these stories raises an interesting possibility. What if certain techniques once existed that we no longer understand? Not necessarily advanced machines or lost industrial technology, perhaps something simpler. A combination of chemistry, material knowledge, and sculptural technique that allowed stone to be shaped in ways that seem impossible when using chisels alone. There is no definitive evidence proving that such methods existed, but there is also no complete explanation for some of the effects we observe. And that uncertainty leaves the question open. Perhaps the sculptors of the past possessed knowledge that was never fully documented, knowledge that slowly disappeared as workshops closed, masters died, and techniques were passed down only through practice rather than written instruction. If that knowledge was lost, the sculptures themselves may be the only remaining record of how it once worked. So we return to the beginning of the investigation, to the marble itself. For centuries, we have been told that these sculptures are the result of patience and skill, that gifted artists, working with simple tools, slowly removed stone until beauty emerged from the block. And there is no reason to doubt the extraordinary dedication of the sculptors who created these works. But the closer we examine the details, the more difficult it becomes to ignore certain questions. Why do some marble sculptures appear to behave like soft material? Why do veins seem to rise beneath the surface of stone? Why do fingers pressing into marble create the illusion of compressed flesh? Why does solid rock sometimes resemble translucent fabric? Perhaps the answer is simply that the artists understood geometry, anatomy, and visual perception with extraordinary precision. Perhaps the illusions were achieved through methods that were never written down, but passed quietly from master to apprentice. That is entirely possible. History is filled with techniques that were once common and later forgotten. But there is another possibility that remains difficult to dismiss. What if the knowledge required to create these effects was more sophisticated than we currently assume? Not necessarily supernatural, not necessarily technological in the modern sense, but knowledge nonetheless. Knowledge of materials, knowledge of stone, knowledge of how certain surfaces respond to pressure, abrasion, or chemical interaction. If such knowledge once existed, how was it lost? Why were the methods never recorded in detail? Why do we possess thousands of pages describing Renaissance painting techniques, yet almost nothing explaining the precise methods used to sculpt marble at its highest level? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if modern sculptors now have access to diamond-tipped tools, powered machinery, and digital modeling software, why is it still so difficult to recreate some of these effects with the same convincing realism? Why do the greatest masterpieces remain nearly impossible to reproduce? The sculptures themselves remain silent. They sit in galleries and churches across the world, admired as achievements of artistic brilliance. But they also represent something else. Evidence. Evidence that at certain moments in history, human knowledge reached extraordinary heights of material understanding. And yet that knowledge did not always survive. Techniques fade, skills disappear, entire traditions vanish when the people who practice them are gone. What we call the pinnacle of human craftsmanship may sometimes be something different. Not the beginning of a tradition, but the last surviving traces of one. So the real mystery may not be how these sculptures were made. The real mystery is simpler. What else did we forget?